All right, let's turn to 2 Samuel chapter 23. Second Samuel chapter 23. So the first 7 verses that we covered last week, we called David's last psalm, and these were the words that David gave as he's coming down to the end of his life. He's not yet quite on his deathbed, but as far as the doctrinal things, the songs that he would write, this is among the last things that David would have to say. What you've got for the rest of chapter 23, 24 are some unique and individual stories. And then when you get into 1 Kings, the first couple chapters, you really are in the declining time of David's life, where you see him come to his deathbed. You see the appointment of Solomon to be the next king. And I don't know that next, anyway, we'll go through verse by verse the life of Solomon. I think we'll get into something else for a little while, but we got a couple of chapters left. The rest of chapter 23 deals with David's mighty men, right? This is from verse 8 down through verse 39. We're going to go through some of this. We'll tell a few stories. We'll learn a few lessons here. I won't read every verse. I'll give you all the exercise and pronunciation if you want to take it. There's a lot of names here that this is the only time that they are mentioned in the Bible. And the Bible that I have does not have the pronunciation guides or helps that you have in some Bibles. And so some of these names we might pass over. That certainly is not an indication of their significance as much as personal embarrassment at stumbling through these names. But let's take a look down here, verse 38 down to verse 39 tonight. And we'll call this lesson For King and Country. For King and Country, as we talk about David's mighty men. And I just want to go through 2 points tonight, just 2 main thoughts. We'll talk, number 1, about valiant men, and then we'll talk about some valuable lessons. Okay? Valiant men and valuable lessons. 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse number 8. It says, "These be the names of the mighty men whom David had. The Tachmonite that sat in the seat, chief among the captains, the same was Adino the Eznite. He lifted up his spear against 800, whom he slew at one time. And after him was Eleazar, the son of Dodo the Ahohite, one of the 3 mighty men with David, when they defied the Philistines that were there gathered together to battle, and the men of Israel were gone away. But he arose and smote the Philistines until his hand was weary, and his hand clave to the sword. And the Lord wrought a great victory that day, and the people returned after him only to spoil. And after him was Shammah, the son of Agi the Hararite. And the Philistines were gathered together in a troop, where a piece of ground full of lentils. And the people fled from the Philistines, but he stood in the midst of the ground and defended it, and slew the Philistines, and the Lord wrought a great victory." In these first few verses, we have 3 different stories. Now, there's going to be over 30 different men that are mentioned here. I think it's 37 different men that are mentioned in this passage of Scripture. Now, not everyone gets their story told. Not everyone gets a full detail of what they've done. That doesn't mean that they were any less loyal to David. It doesn't mean that they were any less important. There's just, if you want to look at some significant events, there are several that are singled out, these first 3, for some very particular acts that they had done, for some very brave, courageous, or valiant efforts that they had put forth. It tells us here in verse number 8, this story of Adino the Eznite, that in one battle, it says that he lifted up his spear against 800, whom he slew at one time. Now, if you were to go to war, you probably wouldn't mind having on your side a guy that could kill 800 men in one battle, right? That speaks to someone who is what? Obviously brave and courageous. This is someone who's very skilled, right? Listen, you can be brave and not be skilled, right? You know, somebody could charge, courageously and bravely, but maybe not necessarily have the ability, right? You don't go into a battle and kill 800 without actually having some skill. I mean, you can imagine, I don't know what you guys know about war, right? But I'm going to tell you, it's probably unlikely that they just lined up 800 in a row and they all just took one turn after another coming after him, right? That's not how wars fought. You're talking about a battle. You're talking about a huge battlefield where, man, there's just guys around all the time. There's enemies, there's soldiers, there's people around everywhere. And in one battle, quickness, right? To kill 800 men, you've got to be quick. You've got to be always moving about, skillful, agile, not to mention brave and courageous, right? 800 at one time. The Bible talks about Samson, the judge, and one of the things that brought him to the spotlight was that he had killed 1,000 Philistines with the jawbone of a donkey. When you can spread them out over weeks and months and years, 1,000 still impressive, but 800 it says there at one time, that's amazing. That is an amazing feat to think that there was a battle in this world where one man stood with a spear and ended up accounting for 800 Philistines. That's just amazing. And then in verse number 9, we are told the story of a man named Eleazar. And when they were in battle with the Philistines, it said there in verse number 9, when they defied the Philistines that were there gathered to battle, the men of Israel were gone away. Here's a battle where, and I don't know what caused them to flee. Maybe they felt they were outnumbered and so some ran away. Maybe the battle got hot and folks realized, man, it looks like we're on the losing side and there's no glory in dying on this battlefield, so they ran. I don't know. It doesn't tell us. It does tell us that during this battle with the Philistines, many of them, the men of Israel, were gone away. But he arose and he smote the Philistines until his hand was weary and his hand clave to the sword. This man decided to stay in the battle and to keep fighting and keep fighting and keep fighting until he was tired, till he was weary. He had been fighting for so long that it's like the sword had just, like his grip on the sword had been so hard and so long, right? It's like it was stuck, right? It's like his hand was glued. His hand was formed right around the edge of that sword. That's amazing language, right? That it would talk about his weariness in battle and how long he was there. That it's like his hand form-fitted to his sword and couldn't let go. His hand clave to the sword. He won a great victory that day. It says in verse 10 that the Lord wrought a great victory that day. And of course, at the end of verse number 10, once the battle was over and there was a victory, guess who came back? Well, everybody else came back then to get some of the spoil. But Eleazar stood and he fought all day. He fought long and hard. He was weary, and his hand clave to the sword. Then we read about verse number 11, a man named Shammah, son of Agi the Hararite. And it says there that there was Philistines gathered into a troop. There was a piece of ground, this small patch of ground where there was some lentils. Shammah just stood right in the midst of it and he defended it. He took ownership of it. He took initiative to stand and guard this field lest the Philistines come and spoil it, lest the Philistines come and take of that which was not theirs. And he fought. And he stood that day in the midst of it and defended it and slew the Philistines, and the Lord wrought a great victory. These are just some of the stories, right? When you hear the Bible talk about David's mighty men, you're talking about men that were loyal, that were brave, that were courageous, men that were hardworking, men that were fighters, men that David could count on. Here we've got the stories of men that don't abandon when times get tough. We got men that don't leave when it seems like victory is not in the cards, or that it's not great odds, right? When the percentages are against them, when the odds are stacked against them, they keep fighting. They keep fighting for their king. They keep fighting for Israel. Patriotic men that loved their country and loved David and loved the Lord. And we see here some just great, great stories of individual heroes. Verse number 13. Those are three prime examples of individuals. Now, verse number 13 begins another series that talk about these mighty men and a particular thing that they did, a particular event. Look at verse 13. It says, "And 3 of the 30 chief went down and came to David in the harvest time unto the cave of Adullam." We read about that, right? We remember the time when David was in the cave, and the troop of the Philistines pitched in the valley of Rephaim. And David was then in a hold. The garrison of the Philistines was then in Bethlehem. And David longed and said, "Oh, that one would give me drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem, which is by the gate." And the 3 mighty men brake through the host of the Philistines and drew water out of the well of Bethlehem that was by the gate, and took it and brought it to David. Nevertheless he would not drink thereof, but poured it out unto the Lord. And he said, "Be it far from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is not this the blood of the men that went in jeopardy of their lives?" Therefore he would not drink it. These things did these 3 mighty men. We have here the story of men that took their lives in their own hands to not necessarily even fulfill a request, but something that they saw that David desired, that he wanted, that he longed for. Now David is in this cave of Adullam. It talks about him being in a hold there. And David, let's just say, call it for what it is, he got homesick, right? And David recalls growing up in Bethlehem. That's the city of David. That's where David's from, right? Bethlehem, we know that. And he said in verse 15, "Oh, that one would give me drink of the water of the well of Bethlehem." Apparently there was something about, the water from home that David, had been a long time since he had, and that he longed for. I don't understand this. Now, I know that the people that live here obviously can distinctly tell the difference, right? Now, I'm from the city, right? I grew up in the city. I did not grow up drinking what you would call well water, right? So I'm not as acquainted with well water as my wife is, as on any of you here, right? That was so weird to me when I heard that, like, y'all can taste the difference, in the water from, the water from home is different than the water you get. So, I guess the water that I've had most of my life was always just, gross and nasty to you all. But I learned that apparently people can really tell the difference. And apparently David could really tell the difference. And he longed, you could imagine, maybe you all are in the city, or you're traveling, and you're living in and out of hotel rooms and airport water fountains. And, after a few weeks of that, you start to what? A glass of water, even from the tap at home, starts to sound delicious. Starts to sound, pretty good compared to what you've got. That's just a small comparison, right, to what David is experiencing here, right? In this cave, he's homesick. He is longing for a drink from this well that was back at home, from back in Bethlehem, the well water of Bethlehem. And it's obviously just, there's a sense in which obviously he's reminiscing, and he misses it. And it's, it's kind of an indication of the spot that he's in right now. Like, man, what I wouldn't give just to be back home. What I wouldn't give just to be able to get a drink out of the wells of Bethlehem. Well, apparently David said that in the ears of the wrong people. Because there were 3 that are mentioned here, not by name, necessarily, but the three mighty men, 3 of the 30 chief, apparently, from verse number 13. They heard what David said. You guys, did you hear that? King's in a bad spot right now. And he's been through a lot. And you know what? It sounds like, this might make him happy. If there's one thing that he longs for, it's a drink from back home. And you read what the Bible says that these men did. It says in verse number 16 that the 3 mighty men break through the host of the Philistines. They didn't wait till it got dark and sneak around the camp. When David put forth this desire or this, feeling that he had, these men listened to that. And they loved their king so much, and they loved David so much, that they were willing to break through the host of the Philistines, who had, according to verse number 14, the garrison of the Philistine was there in Bethlehem, and they were willing to break through that to go and find this well and bring David back a drink. And what they did meant so much to David. It says in verse number 16 that he couldn't even drink it. He says, they brought it to David, nevertheless he would not drink thereof, but poured it out unto the Lord. Like David, saw what they did, and he couldn't even drink it, right? It meant so much to him. This was a gift of untold wealth and value. It was a drink of water, but it meant something, right? This showed the loyalty of these men, the love that they had for David, the willingness to jeopardy their lives, to put their own selves out there at risk, to take their own lives in their own hands and risk it all to fulfill a desire that David had, right? It's not even their own desire. It's not even something that they want. It's something he wanted. And they were willing to risk it. And they bring this water back to David, and he actually pours it out as an offering to the Lord. That's what it meant to David. Something so cherished, something so valuable that he would offer it then to the Lord. He says in verse 17, "Be it far from me, O Lord, that I should do this. Is not this the blood of the men that went in jeopardy of their lives?" Lord, these men risked their lives for this. He knew he couldn't drink it, right? There was something that was so special, it meant so much. That's the kind of men that David had around him. When we say David's mighty men, we're not just talking about good soldiers. There's something about this that goes beyond skill. There's something in this event that goes beyond talent on a battlefield. These are men that are in tune with the heart's desire of David, and that they would risk themselves to make him happy, that they would risk themselves to fulfill a wish or a desire. Not that David asked them to go get it, not that David required them to go get it, but their willingness to do this for their king, for their leader, for David. It meant very, very much to him. This is an incredible example of the loyalty that these men had. So whereas the first, few verses, you've got that example of of bravery, examples of courage, but skill as well. This goes well beyond that. We're past bravery and skill. We are now into the heart that these men had for David. This meant risking their lives. There's any number of people that could have still considered themselves patriotic, and any number of people that could have still considered themselves obedient to David when David said, "Oh, that I just had a drink from the well waters of Bethlehem." People could have still been obedient and patriotic and said, "Yeah, that sounds good, doesn't it? Man, that sounds real nice right now. Anyway, what's the next plan? What are we doing next," right? These men, they risked it all for a drink of water. And once David sees that, obviously he's like, "No, we're going to pour this out for the Lord. Lord, I can't take advantage of my men like this." And he pours it out before the Lord. And then from verse 18 down through verse number 39, we actually have a list. And many of these names are significant, and many of them we know. Many of them we don't know. There's a lot of names in here that this is the only time in the Bible these names are mentioned. We don't know anything about them. We don't know their story. We don't know who their families are. We don't know where everyone maybe necessarily comes from. Some of them we hear that it's the son of this person or the son of this person. Some of them all we hear is the region maybe that they were from. And some of them we never get to hear the exploits that they did. Some of them we do. There's a man mentioned here in verse number 18. It says, Abishai, the brother of Joab, the son of Zeruiah. He was chief among 3. He lifted up his spear against 300 and slew them and had the name among 3. Was he not most honorable of 3? Therefore he was their captain. Howbeit he attained not unto the first 3. Now, it's not 800, right? It's not the 800 that it mentioned about the one guy, but hey, 300 men in a battle, how many can you take? BJ, how many men could you take in a fight? I can whip most of the women in here. I don't know about all the men, especially if y'all gang up. So, it's not the 800, right, of Adino the Eznite, but man, Abishai, the brother of Joab. This Abishai, he was one that had been loyal to David from pretty early on. If you don't remember that name, of course, brother of Joab, this is the son of Zeruiah. This means that he's David's nephew, one of David's nephews. There's a story back from 1 Samuel chapter 26 where, remember how Saul had encamped against David and Saul had fallen asleep with all of his soldiers there, and David and one of his friends, or one of his companions and those loyal to him went, and they were actually able to go right through the midst while Saul and them were asleep. You know who that was? That was Abishai. And it was Abishai who said, oh man, the Lord has delivered Saul into your hand. Like Abishai was ready right then and there to end it, to have David kill Saul and end it all right there, right? This guy's been with David loyal from the beginning, willing to fight, willing to battle. We read in verse 24 about Asahel, the brother of Joab. He was one of the 30. Asahel, you remember back from the stories in early 2 Samuel, where after Saul had died and the next one had risen up and he was pursuing after Abner. That's who Asahel was. Remember how the Bible spoke of him being so quick, so fleet of foot, like he was a fast runner. And he starts chasing after Abner, and he's catching him, and he's catching him. And Abner realizes, I can't run anymore. I'm going to have to stand, turn, and fight. And he does, and he actually kills Asahel. He takes his spear, he's able to run him through. It says that he gets him below that 5th rib there, and Asahel dies. He was one of David's mighty men. We read here in verse 20 about a man named Benaiah. He's one of the more famous ones out of David's mighty men, right? Benaiah, it says in verse 20, the son of Jehoiada, the son of a valiant man of Kabzeel, who had done many acts. He slew 2 lion-like men of Moab. He went down also and slew a lion in the midst of a pit in time of snow. And he slew an Egyptian, a goodly man, and the Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but he went down to him with a staff. He plucked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and slew him with his own spear. These things did Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, and had the name among 3 mighty men. Benaiah was the captain of one of David's personal guards. We read about the Chelethites, the Pelethites there, those that were David's loyal men pretty well from the beginning. Benaiah was amongst them. Benaiah was the one, of course, with these acts that are mentioned here, it mentions him doing many, many acts. Benaiah became one who was loyal to David and to Israel. You read later in the scriptures that Benaiah was one of the ones that came to the aid of Solomon. After David had come to his deathbed and David had appointed Solomon to be the next king, you remember David had another son, Adonijah, who tried to rise up and tried to claim the throne at David's death as well. But Benaiah was one that stayed loyal to the line David had given, that he was the one that remained loyal to Solomon and made sure that he could be anointed and crowned as king. Benaiah was the one. I'm going to give you a little spoiler alert here because we're not going to talk all through 1 Kings. Benaiah is the one that actually ends up taking care of Joab. Joab's been a rascal, right? He's been an interesting character because there's a couple of different ways to look at Joab. Joab is patriotic and he's loyal to Uncle David. He's not very obedient to Uncle David, right? So he's not unloyal from the perspective of he wants David to succeed, he wants David to be king, he's going to be faithful to king and country that way. But there are times that Joab basically thinks that he knows better than David, right? There are times that David gave strict commands, or here's a couple of examples: people not to kill. And Joab takes it upon himself to kill them anyway, right? Abner, Absalom. We read a couple of weeks ago, remember when David, in a show of good faith, took Amasa, and he was the one that Absalom had made captain over his army. And in a show of good faith, and a sign of reconciliation, David took Amasa after Absalom's death and made him captain over his army. Yeah, Joab killed him. Joab is not what you'd call obedient, even to David's wishes. Now, I think he's loyal. I think he's courageous. I think he's patriotic. I think Joab is one that if you go to war, you would want him on your side. But he's kind of cunning, and he's underhanded, and there'll be times that he stretches the rules and he does things his own way, and that even expresses itself in disobedience to David. And when David dies, one of the things that he tells Solomon at the end of his life is that after I'm gone, you probably ought to do something about Joab. And Solomon does. And the one that actually ends up taking care of Joab and killing him is this man, Benaiah. So when the Bible says he does many acts, it's not kidding. Here's a man that has been faithful and loyal to David from the beginning, from the time that the disgruntled and the discontent and the poor come to David. Benaiah is among them, and he sees it through all the way till David's son becomes successor and king. Mighty men. There's another mighty man that you know. In verse 39, Uriah the Hittite. Remember that name? You guys remember who Uriah was? He was the one that was off fighting a battle while David stayed back home and saw this beautiful woman on the housetop next door. Her name was Bathsheba. She was the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of David's mighty men. And David had him killed so that he could take his wife, so that he could cover up what he had done in committing adultery. And the thing about it was, what made David's act so treacherous was that he sent word to Joab to put Uriah at the forefront of a heated battle. And Uriah would have done that anyway. He's one of David's valiant, courageous, mighty men. And he's mentioned here. And he's been dead a long time now. But he is one that from the time David became king was one that David could rely on as loyal, to fight, to be faithful, to defend him. That makes the story of David and what happens there in 2 Samuel chapter 11 and 12, it makes it all the more sad, right? When you realize this wasn't just a random guy, that David fell in love with his wife and had him killed. Like, this is one of the 30-some that the Bible specifically mentions. This was one of the good ones. This was one of the main ones. This is one of the valiant, mighty men that David had. Uriah the Hittite. Take a look sometime. Again, there's names that are mentioned here that we don't know what they did. But when it comes down to the end, there needs to be a record. We have followed David now from the beginning, from the time that he was taken from the shepherd's fold till now he's come to the end of his life. And there have been nuggets sprinkled all along the way, names and battles that happened for David and with David. And it's time to name some of those heroes. It's time to name some of those that have been faithful and loyal, fought for him from the beginning. And that's what this passage does. Now, lastly, number 2, valuable lessons. I'll mention a few of them. First of all, of course, the value of loyalty. You go back to 1 Samuel chapter 22, and that's when a lot of these men were gathered together. In 1 Samuel 22, 1 Samuel chapter 22, Saul is still king over Israel. And yet in 1 Samuel 22, verse 1, David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. We read about that. And when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. And everyone that was in distress, and everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented gathered themselves unto him. And he became a captain over them, and there were with him about 400 men. When they were all low, right? When David's low, David's in a cave. David's not yet been, Saul is still alive. Saul would still like to hunt him. Saul would still like to see him gone. And David has not become the king of Israel yet. He's low. And these men are pretty low. They're in distress. They're discontented. They're indebted. They're plagued by the current administration as well. They're unhappy with the state of things in Israel. Saul was chosen to be king because he looked the part and thought he could be trusted to be the part, and he couldn't. And these men came to David at their low point, and when David was at one of his low points. And that's what loyalty is. They banded together, and from that day, they were consistently together, faithful and loyal to each other. From the time of 1 Samuel chapter 22, listen, David's life has not been like, oh, well, David comes from the sheepfold and David kills Goliath, and man, David's fame takes off and it's just, an escalation all the way till he gets to heaven, right? No, that is not how David's life has been, has it? David's life has been this kind of mess. You know who's been there, faithful and loyal this whole time? There's a bunch of names in 2 Samuel 23. That's what loyalty is. Consistency. Regardless of the success, regardless of how good the times are or how bad the times are, that's what loyalty is. Loyalty does not jump ship when things get hard. Loyalty doesn't jump ship. Loyalty doesn't turn against David when times are rough or when he's down. It's easy to jump on David's coattails when Saul is slain his thousands and David is 10,000s, and David's getting ready to come in glory. It's easy to grab those coattails and ride David's success to the top. But that's not how this works out. These men stay loyal to him when David's on his way up and when David's on his way down. That's how you know when someone's truly loyal. That's how you know what faithfulness is. 2 Samuel chapter 23, look at our text there. I'm going to give you here's a lesson, and listen, you just have to know that this is how life is sometimes. Look at verse 10. We were reading about Eleazar. It says in verse 10, he arose, smote the Philistines. Well, let me read the end of verse 9. The men of Israel were gone away. Now verse 10, he arose and smote the Philistines until his hand was weary, and his hand clave unto the sword. And the Lord wrought a great victory that day, and the people returned after him only to spoil. You just got to know that that's how it works sometimes in life. You don't let your courage, your determination, your faithfulness, your loyalty, your service, whatever word you want to fill in there, don't let it be determined by people. Because sometimes this is how people are, right? When there's a battle to fight, a whole bunch of them fled. And here you've got Eleazar who fights so long and hard that his hand cleaves to the sword. And guess what happens when the battle's over? Everybody comes back to grab some of the victory spoils. That's how life is sometimes. And there are some people that'll bail when times are hard, and then once there's victory and there's success, they'll come in and they'll try to pick up the pieces with it, right? These men are not like that, right? Don't let those kind of folks discourage you. Don't let those if you see people bailing, if you see folks giving up, if you see folks paling away, don't do that. You keep on, keep faithful, keep loyal, and keep serving. He's the hero there in that passage. These people showed themselves, right? It takes no courage, it takes no guts to come in once all the work is done, once all the battle has been fought, and try to grab into the success of it, right? That doesn't take any effort. That doesn't take any courage at all. So don't let that part be part of our character. Let's be the ones that are in there giving it our best and doing what we can. Who are these men? Some of these men, all they have is their name that's given. We don't know anything else that they did. Listen, that's okay. Sometimes true heroes don't get, right? They don't get a very long eulogy. There's some folks that we don't even know about, right? You get to the book of Hebrews and the writer's talking about those heroes of faith, and time would fail me, he says, to talk about Gideon and Barak, and he starts mentioning names, and he doesn't even talk about what they did. He just mentions their name. You know, he talks about Abraham and gives 3 or 4 verses. He talks about Moses and gives 3 or 4 verses. And realizes, man, if I keep going, Hebrews chapter 11 could be a lot longer than it is. Time would fail me. And he mentions a few names. And then he gets to an episode where he doesn't even mention their names. What about those who were sawn asunder? What about those that gave their lives? What about those that were, that were passed through the fire? What about those? The names that don't get mentioned, or the names that get mentioned and there's no extra story with it, right? These men not having their stories mentioned, that's okay. They were known to David. They were loyal to David, and they meant something, and they mattered. In this world, your story may never be told. I can't even guarantee that your name will always be told. But the Bible tells us that the Lord is not unfaithful to forget our labor of love. That if we work and if we serve Him, that He is able and He remembers. And 1 Corinthians chapter 15 tells us and encourages us to just keep on. Because, let me read it real quick so that I don't misquote it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in verse 58, therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Now, I can't promise you fame. I can't promise you that your name will be remembered in the annals of history. I can tell you that God doesn't forget, that He will reward your labor of love, and that be steadfast, be unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Your labor is not in vain. People might not remember it. You may not get named on a list. That's okay, right? These men are named on a list, but we don't even know their story. We don't know what they did. We don't know how many people this guy killed with a spear, and we don't know how many Philistines this guy went after, but we know, you know what? This guy meant something to David. These men served their king in spite of personal risk. We are told of men that jeoparded themselves just to go and get David a cup of water, a drink of water from the well at Bethlehem. And you come over later in the book of Revelation in chapter 12. In Revelation chapter 12, I just like the way that this phrases the testimony of these individuals. It says here, Revelation 12, verse 10, it says, I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now has come salvation and strength, the kingdom of our God and the power of His Christ. For the accuser of our brethren is cast down, which accused them before our God day and night. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, and they loved not their lives unto death. There's a lot of things that I would like to think that I'm willing to do. But I'm going to be honest with you. If you tell me that my next course involves the risk of death, I ain't sure that I'm going to pursue it. Right? I'm just not sure that I'm going to pursue it. Now, I would like to think that if the time came and that course was called service to the Lord, and you know what? Your service to the Lord comes with this risk. I would like to think that in that day the Lord would give me grace and I might have courage to pursue that path even if it was at risk. Those men did that for David. And in this prophetical word, we read about those saints that overcame him, that overcame the accuser of the brethren, and they loved not their lives unto the death, right? There will be martyrs. There will be those that would even give their lives. These men served their king when it was risky to serve him. These men performed because their king had a wish and had a desire. And they performed it, regardless of what it cost them. That is our calling, to serve the Lord. Let's not worry so much about, the risk to our own satisfaction, the risk to our own name, maybe not even if it called for it, the risk to our own health or our own life. We have a king, we have a Lord that has a wish, that has a desire, that has given us his word. Let's be faithful, let's be loyal, and be obedient to that. How does the world define the word hero? Any number of ways, right? A hero to some people is maybe someone that they just look up to. Maybe it's because they're good at a sport, right? Maybe a good basketball player or a baseball player. Kids would say, "Man, that's my hero," and they really like him, right? They would like to trade spots with him. They would like to be in the same position. They admire them, whatever it may be. Maybe some successful politician, right? Maybe because he wins a great campaign, he's famous. What about a general, right? That maybe leads a successful campaign, wins a great war. How does the world define a hero? So many different ways. But when you come to 2 Samuel chapter 23, you've got a lot of heroes. And to David, they were heroes because they would fight for him and for Israel, for king and country. Their loyalty, as David comes down to the end of his life, needed to be mentioned. It needed to be recorded. 2 Samuel chapter 23 is not in chronological order, right? These are not things that happened at the end of David's life. These are nuggets of things that have been sprinkled all throughout David from the time that he got in that cave and those first band of loyal ones came to him. And yet piece by piece, these men have proven themselves loyal to David and faithful to him in the ups and in the downs. That's what loyalty is, right? It takes nothing to be loyal. It takes nothing to ride coattails of somebody that's just continually on the way up. But when David's in a cave, and when David's being hunted, and when David's son is trying to overthrow him, and when David is in the midst of terrible, terrible judgment, even from God because of his own sins, these men stayed with him and were loyal. And so when you read these names and you read these exploits from 2 Samuel chapter 23, I even passed over a number of them, right? Just because I realized that I probably couldn't pronounce them well, and I don't have stories to tell about them because they're not mentioned. But every one of these names had done something for David. Every one of these names is a story of loyalty and faithfulness. And I pray that at the end of our lives it could be said the same about us. Maybe our story's not told, but when it gets down to the end, that we proved our loyalty, we proved our faithfulness to the Lord through dedicated service, through obedience to him. All right? Good stories about David's mighty men.